Growing up, I always lamented the fact that I missed out on the days where arcades were all the craze. The days where you would find dozens upon dozens of kids hanging out, playing everything from Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat to Daytona Racing and even the classic Ninja Turtles game. While I sadly missed out on the fun of the 80s arcade scene, what I can claim to have been part of is the early days of online gaming. I was fortunate enough to not just play the original Diablo, but also to have it as my very first online game ever. Now, I recall so many stories from those days too, but one in particular that comes to mind is when my grandmother had come to visit one day after church. At that time, we had one computer in the house, and it was the family computer that sat in our living room off to the side. That's where I was. And when my grandmother came through the door and said her hellos to my parents, she soon turned her attention to my brother and I, and you can imagine her shock and dismay whenever she caught a glimpse of that fittingly devilish title screen for Diablo 1. I can still hear her chastising me now. She said something like, "Diablo means the devil, and I shouldn't be playing games associated with the devil." I remember trying to reason with her, explaining that the point of the game was to defeat Diablo, not be Diablo. Kind of ironic, as I hadn't yet beaten the game and I didn't realize just how wrong the ending was going to prove me. See, this may have been the late 90s, but it wasn't too far evolved past the 80s, where Dungeons & Dragons had all the parents of that decade terrified. They were afraid that their nerdy kids were going to turn into satanic worshippers overnight. Anyway, I remember my parents getting an earful from her too, but thankfully, they let me continue to play Diablo, and I went on to get many wonderful hours out of that amazing game. Admittedly, I did develop something of an addiction while playing Diablo, and while I eventually did move on to other hobbies, and even just other games, this devil-infested action RPG managed to hold me in thrall for many a school night. And speaking of nights, the game was actually pretty creepy at first too. It was slow, it was dark and gritty, and it had no aversion to showing blood, guts, and horrible creatures all clamoring to cut your valiant hero down in their tracks. I'll never forget the sound of the game's first real boss, terrifyingly named the Butcher, who had already gained this nickname by slaughtering angry villagers who had been led into his bloody lair by a character named Lazarus, who was a traitor in the game. They were on their way to save a kidnapped child too. These weren't bad people, and what had befallen them was a really, really bad fate. That's the kind of dark storytelling Diablo 1 embraced, and when you finally made your way to that boss, you'd almost be guaranteed a jump scare too. Opening the otherwise unremarkable door leading to the boss room would activate his infamous voice line I'll probably never forget my entire life. The next thing you'd see is this monstrous demon wielding a humongous butcher's knife, making a beeline straight for you. The room itself was no better either, as it was full of meat hooks, all of which were occupied by his previous victims. Now, as a kid, you can imagine that even with these graphics, that was some chilling stuff. I loved it though. Overcoming those scary challenges, being rewarded with experience, better weapons, better armor, and ultimately moving on to greater walls to climb, is what the Diablo experience was all about back then. This game was brutal too. Unlike its predecessors, which over time would sort of dumb down or otherwise streamline both the challenge and the mechanics of the game, Diablo 1 did not want to hold your hand for long. If you died in that game, you dropped everything you had equipped on your character. You could run back and get that magical sword, but you'd risk death again, or worse. Another dastardly player could swoop in and take your items. Yeah, they could come in and just take everything from you, or they could just betray you at any time after joining your team. To be honest, that's not a feature I particularly miss about Diablo, but it did make for a very oppressive and genuinely tense gameplay loop at the time. However, it wasn't until Diablo 2 that Blizzard perfected what it meant to be a Diablo game. Everything was bigger and better. Even if some of the small town horrors from the first Diablo game were lost in that upgrade, it didn't matter, because now the world of Diablo had expanded far beyond the scope of one small town. Now you were traversing entire plains, delving deep into caves beneath them, trekking through forests, through deserts, and even across the ocean, well into monster-infested jungles, until you finally found yourself at the very gates of hell. If you played the expansion, Throne of Baal, you even got to see the barbarian peoples in their frigid mountain home. So there was a lot more to see and do in the first Diablo sequel. If Diablo 1 consumed my childhood, Diablo 2 devoured my teen years. I played this game daily at the time and even created my own clan full of like-minded people that I had met while playing. I called the guild Oblivion's Angels, which feels appropriately edgy looking back. I mean, I was an angsty teenager after all, so bear with me. Still, OA as we called it was a friendly group of people. We helped each other out, we dueled with other players, and in general we enjoyed the game. We were never the best, but we had so much fun playing the game that it really didn't matter. If you see this video and you were in that clan, leave me a comment. It's ancient history now, but I hope everyone from back then is doing well today. Guilds and dueling aside, there was so much fun to be had in Diablo 2 even after you had beaten the game. There was the now infamous secret cow level that you could play through, which people did to gain experience and find rare items once they'd already beaten everything else. And there was even more if you ventured into the popular expansion of the game. Creating a character back then centered around finding magic items and just running through and collecting those items was such a relaxing thing to do. You'd get a real shot of dopamine each time a valuable item had dropped from Mephisto in Act 3 or Diablo in Act 4, so forth and so on. It was a really satisfying gameplay loop, to say the least. Nowadays, you can play Diablo 2 Resurrected and experience the original game with far better graphics and a renewed lifespan online. Like a phoenix from the ashes, this remake of Diablo 2 is definitely the way to play the game now. I know there are those who still prefer the original, but for any newcomer or even old head who's revisiting this masterclass of an action RPG, don't hesitate to pick up Resurrected. I know Diablo 4 is right around the corner now, but this game holds its own and is worth your time, until you can get your hands on its newest sequel at the very least. As for Diablo 1, I would love to see a faithful remake in the vein of what we got with Resurrected for Diablo 2, but until such a time, it's difficult to recommend trying to play that game now. I haven't personally tested it in a few years, but it's likely that trying to run it on new hardware, and even software alike, will result in some issues that may need to be sorted through to actually play the game. Still, if we ever do get a remake, I highly recommend giving it a try as well. Diablo 3 is a game that never caught my interest quite the same way its predecessors did. I remember wanting to play it too because my friends were enjoying it, but never really being able to find the passion that I once held for the series. I think it was somewhat to do with the drastic change in art style, where they changed the game to have a more Warcraft or cartoon-like aesthetic. This wasn't enough by itself to turn me away from the game though. What really kept me away, I think, was that the game sort of lost its identity and became this engine by which Blizzard tried all of its weird monetization schemes. From making loot in the game worth real-life money and forcing players to always be online when playing, this game definitely lost me in the sauce, so to speak. That said, it's not all doom and gloom, and looking back, I think Diablo 3 had a decent story and would have been a fun game to play through with my friends if I could just get over those hurdles. The cinematics were of course amazing too, and I think what Blizzard learned from this game's ups and downs is ultimately what we have to thank for how much better Diablo 4 seems like it's going to be. Speaking of Diablo 4, I recently got my hands on it during the free beta weekend. Now I didn't overstay my welcome, but getting to level 6 with my friends was more than enough to have me excited for the full release coming this June. I think it's going to be the sequel most fans have been waiting for, and while I do still have a few reservations, I don't mind recommending you give Diablo 4 a try as soon as it's available. It really does seem like the developers are learning from their missteps with previous games, including both Diablo 3 and Diablo Immortal. So far, it feels like a very nice melding of the older games with new and welcome features such as the ability to customize the appearance of your character, rather than being given a default appearance restricted to your class only. The classes themselves all seem fantastic too. First up, we have Barbarians making their triumphant return for a third game, not including Diablo Immortal. In full disclosure, this was my favorite class back in Diablo 2, and it'll probably be the one I play in Diablo 4. If you don't know what a barbarian is, in Diablo they're basically these brutish, nomadic warriors who are capable of great physical feats. And also making a return yet again is the Necromancer, a class centered around undeath and curses that, in my opinion, has never looked better. And one more reason why I feel they're harkening back to Diablo 1 and 2 is the fact that we get the Sorcerer/Sorceress class again. I loved this class in Diablo 2, and at least in that game, the Sorceress class was centered around controlling the elements such as fire, ice, and electricity. They also possessed the ability to teleport around the battlefield, which made them a really fun class to play, especially if you wanted to be highly mobile. Another class that's a throwback to Diablo 1 and was still present as a henchman as well as a plot point in Diablo 2 is the Rogue class. If you like fast, deadly characters who dual-wield knives and small swords, this is probably going to be the class for you. And lastly, the Druid really got an interesting glow-up in Diablo 4. At least the male version of the character seems to be even bigger than the Barbarian. Druids in the Diablo series are able to shift into powerful creatures such as werebears and werewolves, and also summon primal elements to assist them in battle. So seeing one of these hulking guys running around, it's going to be pretty fun. Now obviously I can't speak to Diablo 4's story too much, even if I could I wouldn't want to anyway. But I'm confident it's going to be an interesting story, and each new chapter is going to be fun for us to cut our way through. So I hope I'll see you there. So yeah, another week, another video. It's been really interesting learning to edit and staying consistent in putting out new content each week. It's been a great source of therapy for me too, as there's no better outlet for revisiting great experiences from my past and getting to share those with everyone who watches. For this week, I'd love to hear what your first online game was. Do you still have fond memories of it now? Also, are you looking forward to Diablo 4? Let me know. I'm going to get out of here and start working on next week's video, so I'll see you on the flip side.